For all intents and purposes, the surrender of Emperor Fate of Amaris to Commanding General Alexander Kerensky on September 29, 2779, ended the Star League Civil War. This was broadcast to the wider hegemony and inner sphere the next day, prompting many to lay down their arms. Not all of the Amaris loyalists believed the news at first, and fighting continued at each of the North American castles Bryan for a time. November 12th is the official end date to the war, though holdouts like the 3rd Mexican Legion in Africa fought into early 2780, and the very last pocket of resistance at Lawrence, Kansas lasted until February 11th. That same year, the last of the Casper drones within the distant Kuiper Belt was located and destroyed. With it died the once formidable space defense system. Only isolated ground installations survived the war, and humanity would never again experiment with advanced artificial intelligence on such a large scale. Of the Amaris Empire armed forces, which at their height had numbered almost 400 regiments, only 9 had survived. The Star League Defense Force was similarly shattered. The Navy had begun the conflict with a fleet of well over 2,000 warships. The SDSs had made them suffer, and less than 20% had escaped destruction. The regular army could at one time call upon 2,000 mech regiments. Now, only 635 remained, but those numbers belie the fact that less than half were even 50% operational. The member state militaries had survived the conflict more or less unscathed. The size of their standing armies remained curiously stagnant throughout the war, but this is because most of their military industrial output had been sold off to the desperate SLDF for enormous profits. Those funds had been redirected into increased warship production, which the Star League Civil War had shown would be a crucial aspect of any future conflict. Indeed, their navies had more than doubled since 2765. 15 years of fighting had changed the face of the inner sphere and periphery almost beyond recognition. No one was quite sure what was going to happen next. All eyes turned to Commanding General Alexander Kerensky. The territorial states of the Magistracy of Canopus, Outworld's Alliance, and Taurian Concordat had notionally won their freedom. Would they be allowed to keep it now that Amaris was defeated? The Rimworld's Republic, largest of all the Periphery realms, no longer existed. The Lyran Commonwealth had annexed their weaker neighbours, and President Lucian Dormax had disappeared into one of the Lyran Intelligence Corps' cells, never to be seen again. Would Kerensky now take action as he had threatened during Operation Almanac? Would the Oberon Confederation or newly formed Finnmark Free Republic rise to take the place of the Rimworlds within the Star League? Would the Commanding General seek vengeance against the Free Worlds League for denying him aid and later trying to seize hegemony worlds? What about the Draconis Combine, who had tacitly supported the Empire and publicly decried Kerensky? Could the Terran hegemony hold together in the aftermath of such a brutal war? What had happened to House Cameron, and who would become the next First Lord? Most importantly of all, what would happen now to Fate of Amaris? To say that many wanted to see him dead would be a colossal understatement. Finding guards to keep him safe from others within the SLDF became a serious challenge for the victorious general. Kerensky vowed that he would stand trial, however, and for the time being, Amaris, his wife Tabori, and their children were held captive in the Imperial Palace. Not long after the official ceasefire, soldiers sifting through the wreckage of the Royal Palace unsealed the throne room for the first time in over 12 years. The scene within was horrific to see. The bodies of the dead Cameron family had been left to rot where they fell. 2 weeks later, Kerensky arrived to see the massacre for himself. He stood alone in the desecrated throne room for 30 minutes, and then immediately departed for Amaris's Canadian redoubt. The Emperor and his family were marched out into the courtyard to meet him, and lined up against the wall. A firing squad positioned themselves opposite. Blindfolds were offered and refused, after which Kerensky gave the order. Fate of Amaris' death on November 25, 2779, was ultimately just one more on top of the approximately 125 million killed during the Star League Civil War. A further 500 million were wounded during the conflict, and more than 1 billion were left homeless. A compelling argument could be made that it indirectly led to many times those numbers, but future events would make the true figures all but unknowable. Regardless, the hegemony had sustained losses not seen since the Taurian Concordat Theatre during the Reunification War, possibly even greater. The fractured people tried to piece themselves back together, but much of the damage was too severe. The commanding general fretted about what to do with Amaris' remains for some time. The last thing he wanted was for his final resting site to become a place of pilgrimage for his supporters, nor did he wish to create rumours of his survival should he destroy the body. Instead, he decided that he would donate it to be used in lab studies, an inglorious end to the man responsible for so much bloodshed. One unusual consequence of the war was the split in the Catholic Church. The New Avalon branch had been shunned by the rest of the Inner Sphere, who instead chose Cardinal Vladimir Kosev of the People's Union of Kazakh to be their pope on March 21st. Their inability to see eye to eye was indicative of the great divides that had emerged in the final years of the Star League. In the aftermath, Alexander Kerensky returned to Geneva and resumed his position as protector of the realm. Many expected to see him follow this up with an announcement that he would rule as First Lord of the Star League, but it did not come at this time. Instead, he declared that there would be free elections for every planetary congress, beginning on March 3rd. What followed was a complete shunning of any individual who had been associated with Amaris. Many worlds had ample reason to hate the Empire, but others sought to wash their hands of their own involvement and complicity in its actions. Jens Panera returned from retirement to resume his post as Director General Pro Tem, but he was one of the few moderates elected. Most were out for blood. Terrible crimes were committed in the name of vengeance. Anyone who had worked within the Empire's bureaucracy was permanently tarred, sometimes literally branded. Reprisal killings were not unheard of, and others took advantage of the witch hunt to fabricate evidence of their rivals' involvement to have them removed. The Berlin Protocols barred any former member of the administrative branches from holding office in the new government. This left the hegemony leadership woefully underskilled for the task of rebuilding post-war. Kerensky's efforts to restore civilian government had backfired in the worst way. The anti-Amaris sentiment only grew as people began to learn of the atrocities committed by the Empire, culminating in the discovery of the Tivoli mines on May 23rd. The Kryptia, Hegemony Security Force, and Office of Policy and Doctrine had spent the last 15 years kidnapping anyone who spoke out against Amaris. Those people had to end up somewhere. The mines were just the worst of several such facilities. Within, they found 2,600 prisoners driven mad by the long dark isolation, and a further 20,000 bodies. Among the others found dead in the wake of the conflict were Ambassador Drago Kurita and his family, murdered by Amaris' goons within their home in the final days of the war. Bringing justice to those responsible became the top priority for the new hegemony government. On June 7th, they announced the Geneva War Trials, in which 37 major war criminals would be tried, charged with genocide, war crimes, crimes against the Star League, and crimes against humanity. Other regional and planetary courts would be holding their own trials in concert. Amaris' inner circle were at the forefront, as were several notable generals, the former president of the Terran Congress, other ministers, and some of the worst criminals within the armed forces, such as the survivors of the 201st Amaris Lancers. Several on the list attempted to flee. Samir and Jari had already been captured at Geneva 3 years earlier, as had Aisling Connor and Patrick Scoffins, as well as Amaris' cousin Rifkin shortly after the war's end. The trials began on August 21st, by which point all but 3 individuals had been located. The remnants of the Department of the Attorney General led proceedings, alongside members of the Judge Advocate General Command. 19 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Peter Amaris, Samir Injari, Lisa Outerbridge, and Patrick Scoffins. A further 14 were given extended prison sentences, which included Ashland Connor. Often, this was just delaying the inevitable, as many perished during their incarceration. Some never made it that far. On September 17th, a member of the Cryptia was able to smuggle poison into Injari's cell. The head of the once mighty Rimworld secret society took his own life. Around this time, the Council Lords began to return to Earth for their first meeting since before the Periphery uprising. Each was invited to attend the executions on October 9th, though only John Davion and Minoru Kurita did so. Commanding General Patrick Scoffins became the last of Amaris' inner circle to meet their fate at the Geneva War Trials, dying before the eyes of his wife, daughter, and grandchildren. Director Lisa Outerbridge of the OPD remained the most prominent of those never found in the aftermath of the war. The belief at the time was that she had been killed during the final year of Operation Liberation, but more recent evidence suggests she had escaped justice by using a false ID to flee to South America, where she presumably lived to old age. An unpalatable end to the woman behind some of the worst atrocities of the era. One day after the hangings, the High Council began their first session since their dismissal by Richard Cameron in 2763. Present at the meeting were First Prince John Davion, Coordinator Minoru Kurita, Chancellor Barbara Liao, Captain General Kenyon Marik, and Archon Robert Steiner, but of the associate members, only Protector Nicoletta Calderon attended. Her exclusion from the meeting would be tacit acceptance of the informal granting of independence at the end of her Freedom War, but she could not afford to be absent should Kerensky renege on that agreement. The Commanding General was present in his capacity as Protector of the Realm. Representing the SLDF and those worlds under martial law was his deputy, Aaron de Chevalier, and President Jens Panetta attended on behalf of the Terran hegemony. One of the few points of agreement among the Council Lords was that the Prime Circuit be restored as quickly as possible, and the Neutral Communications Ministry continue to operate. The hyperpulse generators at Geneva and Tacoma were found to be complete write-offs, but the discovery of an incomplete facility kept hidden from Amaris gave them hope that Terra could soon be reconnected with the rest of the Inner Sphere. Nicoletta Calderon suggested that the best candidate to lead the administrative branch was Jerome Blake, who was both supremely qualified and somewhat of a folk hero. Blake was at the time working on the completion of the Hilton Head HPG facility, and remained unaware of discussions until the High Council reached an agreement on October 14th. Only John Davion abstained from the vote, the rest appointing him as Minister of Communications. Unfortunately, this was one of the rare moments of consensus among the Council, and with it devolving into bickering soon after, Calderon took her leave and returned to the Concordat after it became clear that the member states had little interest in the Periphery. Of the many thousands of decisions that the High Council would need to make, all were secondary compared to the key issue on everyone's minds: who would become the next First Lord? Alexander Kerensky had become a legend across all of human colonized space, and it very quickly became clear that he would not be voted in. Privately, this suited Alexander just fine. He did not have a desire to rule, and since publicly he did not have a family, and did not wish to expose his children to the world of politics, his assumption of the position would only lead to an inevitable succession crisis down the line. Regardless, his frustration continued to build over the first week as he listened to the petty bickering going on around him. It became apparent that he would be an obstacle in the path of every one of the Council Lord's schemes. On October 18th, Robert Steiner made a proposal that would later shock the Inner Sphere. He moved to have Kerensky stripped of his title of Protector of the Realm, and his position within the High Council revoked. His reasons for doing so came largely from the fear that the Commanding General might declare that Operation Almanac be reversed and the Rimworld's government be reinstated. Before anyone stopped to contemplate the far-reaching consequences of their actions, each Council Lord had given their assent. As John Davion began to read their pronouncement into the record, Alexander stood and motioned him to silence. Standing before them, he methodically worked across his uniform, removing every medal, commendation, insignia, and badge of office. Turning to the robe he wore as Protector, he tore the garment in half, then simply left. The memoirs of those present reveal a mix of emotions. Some of the council felt they had achieved a victory against an old enemy, or even nemesis. Others were suddenly confronted with the foolishness of their actions and expressed a deep regret. Kerensky departed for New Earth soon after, where he once again took charge of the battered Stalag Defense Force. To prevent public outcry, the High Council had confirmed him in his post as commanding general, but had decreed that Terra become demilitarized and the SLDF return to their peacetime stations. Kerensky was not inclined to do either though. On November 21st, the Chevalier informed him that he had spoken to every army and corps commander within the defense force, and that every one of them was prepared to back Alexander in overthrowing the High Council. Kerensky, however, still remained loyal to the ideals of the Stalag and declined the offer. This did not prevent the anti-Council Lord sentiment from growing within the SLDF, and a cabal formed around Major General Loren Hayes continued to plan such an operation, codenamed Case Red. The hegemony during this time was in serious turmoil. The situation on a given planet depended on its proximity to the realm's borders. The Outer Worlds had been liberated first, and had years to recover during the closing stages of the war, all while the member states were flooding them with aid in an effort to entice them to switch sides. The core systems were affected the most by the escalating destruction, and had the least amount of time to rebuild. In the years immediately following the ceasefire, the hegemony population migrated outwards. Nowhere was this more pronounced than on Terra itself, where half of the 12 billion inhabitants departed for new homes. After 11 months of constant deliberations, tensions within the High Council had soared beyond recovery. Each leader had advanced their own name as a candidate for First Lord, but no agreement could be reached. Attempts at bribery and intimidation had not succeeded. John Davion insisted that Richard Cameron had named him regent, but others were sure that was a pathetic ruse. One among them knew the truth, however. In one of Richard's last correspondence, he had informed the Kuritan Lord of his decision, but Minoru held his tongue. On August 12, 2781, the Council Lords finally agreed to disagree and went their separate ways. A brief statement was issued declaring that the High Council was disbanding permanently. With that announcement, every administrative branch of the Bureau of Stalag Affairs ceased operations, save for the Ministry of Communications. Again, Kerensky was pressured to take up the mantle himself, but once more he refused. Instead, he spent the next 2 years travelling between the member states, hoping to convince them to resume dialogues with their neighbours in the hope of saving the Stalag. They each received him politely, save Kenyan Marik, who spurned an audience and dispatched the Speaker of the Parliament to dismiss him, but none were moved by his words. Jerome Blake, meanwhile, was contacting the former Council Lords asking them for direction. Those that responded essentially gave him carte blanche to do as he wished. One of his first changes was to increase the price of sending official or military messages through the HPGs, using the additional funds to assist in the recovery effort. On April 12, 2783, Jerome decided to halt reconstruction efforts at Unity City, declaring that the court of the Stalag would remain empty until a new First Lord was chosen. By then, the worst of the humanitarian crisis had been dealt with, and Blake's name within the hegemony, particularly on Terra, was revered. 2783 was the year that the member states abandoned the pretense that they wanted the hegemony to survive. Several of the shared border worlds had already been unofficially claimed, but now the Terran-appointed administrators and government were ushered out entirely, sometimes at gunpoint. The first system to realign itself officially was Surma on July 19th. Furthermore, worlds that were firmly within the Terran provinces were also picked at by each of their neighbours, as were border worlds between the other member states. Most troubling was the security forces dispatched by Chancellor Barbara Liao to the infamous world of Andurian.
Even after the conclusion of the war and the disbandment of the High Council, the Stalag Defense Force was still receiving an influx of new recruits. Two such individuals who showed incredible promise but were too young to serve during the Civil War were David Kolassa and Rafe Cardan. Each had the potential to become future leaders before they disappeared out of the history books. Their home nations would much rather have retained their services within their own house militaries than see them join up with Kerensky, and so in the final years of the Star League, they did what they could to impede SLDF recruitment.
Throughout this period, the house militaries were continuing to expand. Some estimates say they had quadrupled in the 30 years since Directive 30 was repealed. Though the true figures don't quite match this exaggeration, it's unquestionable that each nation saw war in its near future. The latest wave of growth came from the many Amaris Empire Armed Forces personnel that were gradually being released from custody. Many of these went on to form new commands within the member or territorial states, some becoming mercenaries, whereas others turned pirate. In August, the Federated Sons began approaching the Star League forces within its domain and offering them generous bonuses to abandon the SLDF and sign on with the AFFS. By the time the news reached Kerensky, the other member states had followed suit and were trying to lure other units to their side. The commanding general demanded that such actions cease immediately, but the council lords were not cowed, and instead ordered Kerensky to step down as head of the Star League Defense Force, something which he did not do. One incident that was indicative of the crumbling SLDF was the case of the Czech Lancers. Only 4 battalions had survived the Periphery campaigns. Those who hadn't retired or turned pirate remained in reserve throughout the rest of the war. By 2783, the 3 colonels had turned on each other, imprisoning a third of their number, while the rest continued to butt heads. When the Lyrans approached and offered a deal, while one battalion refused outright, another accepted a mercenary contract with the Commonwealth as the Iron Ravens. Their first mission was to spring their companions from internment, something which cost the lives of dozens of hegemony loyalists. It's theorized that Alexander Kerensky decided on his next course of action that September. The continued defection of several more full regiments confirmed his fears about what would happen to the Star League Defense Force if he did nothing. After first discussing it with his deputy de Chevalier, he informed Jerome Blake of his intentions that winter at the completion ceremony for the Hilton Head HPG. Throughout the latter months of 2783, the Terran shipyards, both big and small, were servicing record numbers of warships, jumpships, and dropships. On February 14, 2784, Kerensky summoned every department head and army or fleet commander, as well as 223 other senior officers of the SLDF, to a nondescript warehouse on Earth. There, he outlined his plans for the future. The Inner Sphere was heading for war, and nothing the Star League Defense Force could do would prevent that. They theoretically still had the strongest military in existence, with as many mechs as the other 5 member states combined, but they were leading an exhausted army with a devastated industrial base over which they only maintained a tenuous political hold. Even if they could supplant one of the ruling houses and somehow hold together a realm many times the size of the hegemony with a populace that would be fervently anti-Star League, the other 4 would simply sweep up the pieces behind them. Similarly, if they stayed in place, they would only be making themselves the biggest target and bringing yet more destruction to the realm they had only just liberated. The longer they remained and did nothing, the more units would be enticed to join up with the other house militaries. The harder they fought to protect the Star League, the greater the odds that the Council Lords would turn to weapons of mass destruction to remove them. From Kerensky's perspective, this left only one option: exodus. They would lead the SLDF into exile, beyond the Inner Sphere and territorial states, into the deep periphery and uncharted space. There, they would find a new home for themselves, and forge a realm that maintained the ideals of the Star League, leaving behind the chaos that was surely to come. His proposal was met with rapturous applause. Not everyone agreed, however. For starters, Jerome Blake thought he was mad to depart now when there was still so much to be done. Among his own officers, resistance coalesced around Major General Lauren Hayes. She did not want to abandon the Inner Sphere, but she was also certainly opposed to offering her services to the House Lords. Kerensky was able to reach a compromise. Every individual within the SLDF would be offered a choice, to stay or go. Those that remained would swear allegiance to the last vestige of the Star League government, Jerome Blake's Ministry of Communications. Word of the planned departure was kept tightly under wraps. Over time, the entire defense force was polled, and almost 80% agreed to leave with Kerensky, representing more than 1,000 regiments, some 2 million men and women, and a further 4 million dependents. Out of respect for their fellow soldiers, those who wished to remain kept silent. Such a massive migration was going to require vast numbers of ships, and so the Stalag went on a spending spree, picking up another 200 transports over the next few months. In total, the Exodus fleet consisted of 402 warships and 1,349 freighters. Not everyone was lucky enough to hear about the plan. The mercenaries who had fought and died alongside the SLDF were notably left in the dark, including many retired Stalag soldiers among their ranks. Each member state continued to swallow up worlds along the hegemony borders throughout 2784, while simultaneously shutting down Stalag oversight on shared planets within their own realms. Barbara Liao had worked to secure the Andorian commonality the previous year, and now dispatched troops towards the second most contentious planet among the Liao people, the disputed Chesterton system. There had already been a brief inconclusive border war just 20 years prior. This apparent aggression caused First Prince John Davion to call in SLDF aid, but they were far too busy to listen to his request.
Of all the mysteries born out of the fall of the Stalag, perhaps the greatest is the legend of a surviving heir to the throne spirited away in the night. Many variations of the story exist, and no doubt most of these myths can be attributed to wishful thinking by Cameron loyalists living under occupation, but perhaps there is some element of truth to them. Conspiracy theorists have often claimed that Richard's child was not killed during the Throne Room massacre, though there are competing ideas as to how they might have survived. One popular theory suggests that before her tragic death, the infant Amanda Cameron was exchanged for another poor child who took her place in Elise Graham's arms. Exactly when such a swap could have happened isn't clear, as Amanda and Elise were secured almost immediately during the coup. A more fanciful notion that some believe is that Elise gave birth to twins, Amanda and a boy named Ian. Hiding the existence of one of the heirs is an idea that has some merit to it when you consider that Simon Cameron had been assassinated just 15 years earlier, and that armed rebellion was already taking place at the time of their birth. Unfortunately, any plan to keep one of the First Lord's twins a secret was fundamentally flawed from the start. If there was one person who Richard would likely have confided in, it would have been Stefan Amaris. He would have acted quickly, and Ian would no doubt have met the same sad fate as his parents. For centuries, these legends were mere speculation, but in 2979, new information came to light. 200 years after the end of the war, the Taurian Concordat discovered an abandoned Black Lion-class warship drifting in an uncolonized system near New Vandenberg, the SLS Tirpitz. Our best sources claim the vessel was stationed within the Terran system on the day of the coup, making it one of only 3 vessels known to have escaped. Could it be that a Cameron survivor had been evacuated and made their way to Kerensky out in the Periphery? Before the Taurians could recover any information from the warship's computers, it was attacked and destroyed by an unknown raiding force with Stalag-era equipment. Their origin and motive remain unknown, but they were subsequently dubbed the Vandenberg White Wings. Another shocking discovery made even more recently might finally lift the veil of mystery on this whole affair. Recovered from the radioactive ruins of Fort Cameron at Unity City was a journal belonging to none other than Colonel Hanny Schmidt of the Royal Black Watch. Her last entries tell a story that beggars belief. After her meeting with Richard Cameron on December 12, 2766, where she failed to convince him of the looming threat posed by Amaris, she put into motion a contingency plan a year in the making. At the first sign of trouble, Major Ian McIntosh would soon switch not just Amanda, but Richard Cameron himself with a body double. From there, the 3 of them would head to the waiting Colossus-class SLS Abyss and depart from Puget Sound for SLS Tirpitz above Luna. Schmidt expressed regret at ordering her subordinate to forcibly remove the First Lord from danger while she herself led the Black Watch in a diversionary final stand. What she could not have known is that Amaris' Operation Apotheosis was so precisely timed that the very first shot to signify its commencement was the one that killed her First Lord. Major McIntosh was likely one of the Black Watch jump infantry that tried heroically to breach the throne room in an effort to rescue their sovereign. The Tirpitz would tragically leave Terra empty-handed. Some knowledge of this plot must have survived the coup and gone on to spawn the rumours of a swap taking place. Furthermore, conflating the name of one of the conspirators, Ian McIntosh, along with the planned evacuation of 2 Camerons appears to be the origin of the twin legend. If the Vandenberg White Wings had only a partial understanding of events on the day of the coup, they may have believed that by destroying the derelict battlecruiser, they were covering up the existence of a Cameron survivor, but failed to realise that none had ever made it off-world. One more fascinating possibility exists, and it is perhaps the most plausible of all these many theories. The legend states that Richard's sole child Amanda was indeed killed, but another heir had been born to his sister Helena. Their pregnancy was a little-known fact at the time, and it's unclear whether she had given birth before she met her end alongside the rest of her family. Stefan Amaris was even reported to have said that her brother Richard was the father, though the veracity of the Mad Emperor's words are unclear. If there was a child, they were not found with their dead mother, as all the bodies were accounted for. It seems unlikely that Amaris would have had them killed separately, given the spectacle he aimed to create with the massacre to begin with. It is equally unlikely that the Emperor was holding Helena's child hostage. 13 years passed between the coup and his downfall, and more than enough time to make some announcement, which he never did. Likewise, had an heir ever reached Kerensky, he would surely have made it known. Their existence would have done enormous damage to the legitimacy of the Empire, making the commanding general's job that much easier. Unless, of course, Alexander had already grown disillusioned by the time he became aware of them. In the aftermath of the Battle for Moscow, Kerensky was reunited with his wife and 2 boys. Around this time, they were approached by a woman named Megan Cole and her foster child Jessica. Incomplete reports from the day state the girl was actually Jerome Winston's sister, Jennifer, found to be living in the city with Nicholas and Andrei, but his family records show no trace of her. More recently unearthed documents suggest that Megan Cole was a former retainer of Richard Cameron's sister Helena. She fled the capital during the coup, apparently taking the infant Jessica with her. The girl's true identity remains a mystery that may never be answered, one of many who would soon leave their old lives behind to start again in uncharted space.
On July 8, 2784, Commanding General Alexander Kerensky dispatched a one-word message across the HBG network: Exodus. With that, the entire SLDF began packing up and departing their home systems. The House Lords demanded an explanation about where all the troops were moving to, but by way of answer, they received only a simple "out on extended maneuvers" transmission. The largest fleet was departing from the Hegemony Corps. With them was Kerensky himself, his wife Katusha, and their 2 boys. Even at this late hour, the existence of Alexander's family remained a closely guarded secret. Their journey began by jumping from New Earth and Terra to Davion and then on to Styx. Panic within the Draconis Combine soared as they saw the armada approach. Kurita had been one of the most antagonistic of all towards Kerensky, and had even supported the Amaris Empire. Now it seemed the SLDF was coming to make them pay. The usual route towards Luthien would take a jump ship next to the Telos system, but confusion grew and the Stalag instead jumped to Deneb-al-Jedi. They did end up crossing the border, making it as far as Annapolis before turning spinward. On October 2nd, the first SLDF ships began appearing within the new Samarkand system. This was the pre-arranged meeting site, and over the coming weeks, more and more transports and warships arrived, completely taking over the jump points and restricting travel. HBG traffic was also on lockdown, a parting gift from Jerome Blake. Commanding the Draconis Combine Recharge Station at New Samarkand was Officer Raymond Sainz. He was the only Kuritan to whom the SLDF would talk, a necessity of using his facility. Despite assurances that this was not an invasion fleet, the destruction of 4 Kuritan aerospace fighters that approached the Armada left some serious doubts in his mind. Sainz himself would disappear a month later after being called aboard Kerensky's flagship, SLS McKenna's Pride. We can only speculate as to what was said, as the DCMS officer never returned, though whether he was offered a place among them, stowed away on board, or met some other fate, we don't know. Among the Draconis Combine High Command, Minoru Kurita's warlords were urging immediate military action as their only hope of survival. Chief among them was his son Jinjiro, the warlord of Galadan. However, the coordinator felt differently. With growing conviction, he believed he understood what Kerensky was planning. When pressed by his commanders on what their orders were, he told them to hold station, responding that masterless warriors tend to gather together before departing a burning castle. The former capital received a flood of civilian traffic as the families aboard the Starleague transports landed to spend their final weeks within the inner sphere on solid ground. The fleet also unloaded any unusable scrap that they had stripped for parts, dumping it into the asteroid field. Before departing, Kerensky approached the medical school at the University of New Samarkand and offered them a grisly donation: the preserved body of Emperor Fate of Amaris. The last transport arrived at New Samarkand on November 1st. The next day, those on planet were ordered to pack up and return to their ships. On the 5th, the first vessel jumped out towards the Periphery. One by one, the rest of the fleet began to vanish. With them went some of the greatest minds and legendary figures in human history, and perhaps the sole hope of sparing the Inner Sphere from the coming carnage. New Samarkand had become the busiest system in all of human space, but as the jump points emptied, only ghosts were left behind. It took a full day for the fleet to depart, until only McKenna's Pride remained. Commanding General Alexander Kerensky took one final look at the worlds he had sacrificed everything to defend, before ordering his ship to jump, taking with them the last light of the Cameron star. And they were never seen again. Well guys, this is it. The end of a long journey. 13 months ago, we started working on this project, and now, after hundreds of hours of work, we've seen it through to the end. I had several goals in mind for myself when I started this, and more or less, we've achieved all of them. But I could not have done it without your continual support. I really want to make it clear how grateful I am to each and every one of you. Yes, of course, thank you to those people who've been directly donating to me, but also to all of those people who've been leaving me comments, leaving likes, sharing the videos around. I remember the days when I started out on this channel and my videos would only get 4 views, and one of them was me checking everything had been uploaded, and 2 of them were bots. So yeah, we've come a long way, and like I said, I could not have done it without your continual support. I want to say thank you to those members of the community who've been collaborating with me on this project. You guys haven't seen the conversations that have been taking place behind the scenes, but I want you to know just how generous they have been, not just with their time, but also their input and feedback. They've really gone above and beyond, done more than I could ever ask them for. As I've said at several points throughout, they have volunteered their time to help make this a better video for you. So please do check them out if you haven't already, and let them know that you appreciate them taking the time to do it. Thank you to B1B Flyer of Camo Specs, Aaron from Death from Above Wargaming, Mechanical Frog, Otto from Nerdy Overanalyzed, Travis from Renegade HPG, Wargamer Fritz. Thank you to Battlebound and Big Red 40 Tech who jumped in at short notice to help me achieve my original release date when one of my earlier plans fell through. Thank you to Your Seat at the Table for providing me with a couple pages I was missing from some of my source books that helped me include another couple of details there. Thank you to Madcat529 who's been fantastic in discussing some of the more technical aspects of making the videos behind the scenes. Thank you to Critical Rocket, not just because he made a video within a video in this final chapter here, but also because his Lore Warrior series played an instrumental part in me becoming a BattleTech fan to begin with. I wouldn't be here today making these videos if I hadn't stumbled across theirs so many years back now. I like to think that someone out there in my audience is maybe another future content creator. It'd be fantastic if I could inspire somebody else to give the hobby a go. And last but not least, thank you to Tex from the Black Pants Legion. Last May they reached out to me when I was going through a bit of a rough spot, just asking how I was. That of course was tremendously kind of them, but it was through that conversation that the idea of a collaborative project with multiple people from within the community first got raised. And so without their kindness there, this project wouldn't have taken the form that it did. A lot of people have been asking me what's next for the future. Now it has always been my intention to go through the entire timeline linearly, including all eras. We're going to say goodbye to Kerensky and his followers, and we're going to stick to the inner sphere and tell the story of the succession wars next. I think we'll catch up with Kerensky at another point down the line, but right now, there are some other stories to tell. So thank you once again for all the encouragement you've offered me over these last few months. If you want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon linked in the description, but you can also help out just by leaving a comment, a like, or especially sharing the videos around. So thank you one final time, and I will hopefully see you again soon on another video.